Hello and welcome to another lecture on macroeconomics. Today our topic is the origins of macroeconomics or the birth of macroeconomics. How macroeconomics as a subject, as a branch of economics came about. And to understand this very issue, the birth of macroeconomics or the origins of macroeconomics, we need to be conversant with four terms or four phenomena. The first one is Ragnar Frisch, a name of an important economist. The second one is classical economics or classical economists. The third one is the Great Depression, and the fourth one is James Keynes or the Keynesian Revolution, Keynesian economics. So if we are conversant with these four terms, four phenomena or four names, we are familiar with them, we have some introduction about these, then it will be very easy for us to appreciate the rise of macroeconomics, the birth of macroeconomics. So let's move to the first one, Ragnar Frisch. His complete name is Ragnar Anton Kettle Frisch. He belonged to Norway, and obviously he was an economist, and he was born in 1895 and he died in 1973. He got his Nobel Prize in 1969, which he shared with another economist at the time. Now, why is Ragnar Frisch important for us to understand the birth of macroeconomics, the origins of macroeconomics? It is because he is the economist who first proposed, who coined the terms microeconomics and macroeconomics. Therefore, his name becomes essential in the context of the birth of macroeconomics. And this also gives us a sense that he understood the need for the development of these two subjects or separation of general economics into two branches, micro and macroeconomics. Therefore, he was the first one to propose the names. However, his main contribution lies in developing statistically informed model for business cycle. So, business cycle, etc. These are the subjects that we study in macroeconomics in coming lectures. So, we may be taking this up. Now, let's move to our second term, which is classical economics or classical economists. James Keynes is important for the birth of macroeconomics, and James Keynes he wrote in brought forward his ideas in 1930s. Okay, and all the economists who wrote about macroeconomy, who wrote about overall economy, the functioning of the overall economy, James Keynes called them classical economists, or called their economics as classical economics. So all the economists who wrote about macroeconomy before James Keynes clubs them together in the term classical. Okay, so therefore this term applies to people who wrote before James Keynes, the classical economists. But we usually distinguish between two groups. In the group which was termed by James Keynes as classical economics or classical economists. One is the classical economics or classical economists, and the second is neoclassical economists. So that's not our discussion right now, but it was just to inform you that we categorize this very group, we subdivide it into two groups. Okay, so this group includes whom James Keynes called classical economists, or clubbed their understanding of economy in classical economics. This includes Adam Smith. It includes David Ricardo, J.S. Mill, Robert Malthus, and then Alfred Marshall, then A.C. Pigot, etc. All these people were called as classical economists by James Keynes. Okay. Now, what is important for us, which we need to understand in the context of understanding this subject, the birth of macroeconomics, the origins of macroeconomics, is that there were special beliefs that the classical economists held about the working of the economy. And one of their beliefs was that what we understand about micro level, about a firm, about a family, for example, or an individual, is also true at the collective level. So they applied the microanalysis to the overall economy. It was one of their approaches in understanding macroeconomy. So their analysis was microeconomic in nature, and one of the beliefs that they had was supply creates its own demand. That is, if you create something, it creates the demand at the same time, because while you're creating something, you are making payment to different factors of production, and that payment will create the demand in the beyond the four walls of the factory, and therefore supply creates its own demand. That was one of the basic beliefs with the classical economists, and they believed also that markets are self-correcting. If, for example, there is overproduction, production is more than demand, what will happen is that the prices of the product of which there is overproduction, the prices will decrease. Once the prices will decrease, people who are buying lesser amounts earlier were buying lesser amounts, now they will buy more amounts of that very product, until every part of it is sold out. Okay, so this was their approach, and they thought that the markets are self-correcting. Markets will correct for any discrepancy that appears. Similarly, if there is unemployment, what will happen is that the unemployed people will go to the factory owners, tell them that, see, we are going to work in your factories at lower wages. Therefore, what will happen is that overall wage rate will come down. Once the overall wage rate will come down, the factory owners will hire more labor till everybody gets employment. So this was their way of thinking, and this was what they believed in, that markets are self-correcting. And finally, the concluding part of their beliefs is that there will be no overproduction, and there will be no unemployment in the long run. As I have explained it through the concept, supply creates its own demand, and markets are self-correcting. So there will be no overproduction, and there will be no unemployment in the long run. It was their belief. Now let's move to the third term, which is very fundamental for the birth of macroeconomics, and this is the Great Depression. Now, what is Great Depression? It means that when there is, for example, overproduction, when what you produce is not, there is no demand for that, is not sold out in the market, and then you reduce the production out because of that, and there will be reduction in GDP, there will be rise in unemployment, because if you don't need to produce, you don't need labor as well. Therefore, there will be reduction in GDP, and there will be increase in unemployment, massive reduction in GDP and massive increase in unemployment. So such a situation is called as depression if it persists for a long time. Now, such a phenomenon took place from 1929 to 1939. It persisted almost more than almost for a decade or more than that period. So its peak came in 1932-33, when we can say unemployment was the highest, GDP reduction was the highest, and then international trade, etc., it was reduced. So it wasn't concerned with, or it wasn't a single country phenomenon, it was a worldwide phenomenon. Every country was affected by the Great Depression of 1929, and the global GDP was reduced by more than 15%, and the global trade, world trade, was reduced by more than 50%. Now you can imagine from these statistics how the severe Great Depression was in terms of reduction of GDP, and in terms of reduction of world trade, and then unemployment, etc., increase in unemployment, etc. Now, when we talk about the United States of America, the industrial production was reduced by 47%, almost 50%. Half the industrial production was now reduced. What industries produced earlier, now only half of that was produced. There was 30% decrease in the real GDP of the economy. There was more than 30% decrease in the prices of the product, general price level, and then unemployment was greater than 20% in that very economy, the world's greatest economy. So the point here is that earlier we talked about classical economics, which believes that there will be no overproduction, there will be no unemployment, massive unemployment for the long run. But over here, what we are witnessing is that there is massive overproduction, massive decrease in GDP, massive unemployment, massive reduction in international trade, and it is persisting for a long time. Therefore, the perceptions that the belief is that classical economists had classical economics put forward were proved to be wrong in the context of the Great Depression. And what the lessons we learn from Great Depression include massive overproduction is possible, massive unemployment is possible, and economy is not self-correcting, which is very important for us to appreciate here. Economies are not self-correcting; they don't correct themselves because we are waiting for a long time, and our no, the market seems not to be in a position to self-correct itself, to rectify its discrepancies. Now came J.M. Keynes, which is the final term which will allow us to understand the origins of macroeconomics, which will help us to understand the origins of macroeconomics. J.M. Keynes, an English economist. He was born in 1883 and he died in 1946. He wrote his book in 1936, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, a path-breaking work. And by 1936, because he was writing even before this, his writing came in 1936 in the form of a book. But even at that time, the leading Western economies had already begun to adopt his policies. That shows us the success of his ideas and with what immediacy these were accepted by the economists of the time, the policymakers of the time. Now, his contributions include, one is that he explained that markets are not necessarily self-correcting. In fact, markets can be self-aggravating. If there is some discrepancy appears in the market, for example, overproduction happens, unemployment increases, there is a reduction in GDP, it can actually spiral into more decrease in GDP, more increase in unemployment, and so on and so forth. So situation can, if we put trust in the market mechanism, what is possibly going to happen is that situation will aggravate more and more the more we wait for the market to correct it, because the market by its very nature has a tendency of putting more and more burden on the parameters which are going wrong. So he said that the markets are not necessarily self-correcting. In fact, they can be self-aggravating. There will be more and more problems can appear. Then he said that massive unemployment and overproduction is possible, which was not only theoretically a possibility, but it was also practically seen in the course of the Great Depression. So there is a possibility of unemployment and overproduction. Now, what is the most significant part that Keynes brought forward? Because the classical economists thought that markets are self-correcting, therefore there was no need for government intervention. They believed that governments should not intervene in the economy, even if something went wrong, because the markets are going to self-correct. But over here, J.M. Keynes is saying that the government needs to intervene to smoothen, to save economies from the bad phases of the trade cycle. So he says that we need to intervene in the economy through our monetary policy and through our fiscal policy. So he suggested that the government should intervene to curb the tendency that we are witnessing in the economy of overproduction or decrease, absence of demand, and then demand should be increased on part of the government. They should come forward through fiscal policies and through monetary policies generally, and correct the situation that is prevailing in the context of the Great Depression. So this led to the birth of macroeconomics, because Keynes challenged the understanding, the analysis, the framework of classical economists, and their framework applied good at the micro level, but it didn't work at the macro level. That is what was brought forth by J.M. Keynes' work. He provided an alternative framework for the macroeconomy, for the overall aggregate economy, for the aggregate variables, and therefore new subject was born we call as macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomics macroeconomic analysis was not sufficient for economy at the aggregate level. This idea came forward. New factors and dynamics came to fore in the wake of Great Depression. There are some new factors, new dynamics, which also we need to appreciate and develop framework for. James Keynes brought to limelight need and efficacy of looking to macroeconomy from a different perspective than was the norm at that time. He's brought a new framework so that economists understand how our macroeconomy actually is working, or the aggregate economy is actually working. And this all led to the birth of macroeconomics as a subject. And from that day onwards, it became a very, very important subject for policymakers, for governments, and for academic institutions. And there's a lot of weightage that we give now to macroeconomics, because it is concerned with the role of government in rectifying discrepancies if there appears in the course of the running of economies, the working of economies. I hope that we appreciate and understand, with the help of these four terms, the birth of macroeconomics, or the origins of macroeconomics. Here we conclude our lecture. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel, Honest Economics English. Thank you very much.